Okay, let's unpack this. We've got quite a stack of sources here today.
Yeah, news reports, research notes, some constitutional analysis too.
All diving into, well, a really complex and, frankly, often contentious topic in the U.S. right now: sanctuary jurisdictions.
Contentious is definitely the word.
And the reason we're really diving in now, it looks like the Trump administration is back at it.
Uh-huh. New executive orders targeting these jurisdictions.
Right, and even publishing these lists that, well, they seem to be causing a fair bit of confusion on the ground.
Yeah, it suggests this debate is far from over.
Clearly.
So our mission with this deep dive is to try and cut through some of that noise. We really want to figure out what sanctuary jurisdiction even means,
If there's one single meaning.
Exactly. And explore the main arguments for and against that are laid out in your material.
We'll look at the recent federal actions, how states and local places are reacting.
And, of course, the legal battles that are really heating up again.
Okay, so we're pulling from a mix here. There's recent news on the EO and reactions, particularly out of Colorado.
Right. Then some background stuff, like from Wikipedia, on the history, definitions, arguments, studies, state policies.
There's analysis from the Constitution Center, looking at the legal side of things.
And AP reporting, specifically checking the accuracy of that new government list that came out.
So our goal then is to basically pull out the crucial details, give you the context you need.
Yeah, help you get a clear, sort of well-rounded picture of what's happening, why it matters, what's really at stake here.
All right, let's start with the absolute basics then, or maybe the lack of basics. What is a sanctuary city or sanctuary jurisdiction?
That's one of the first tricky parts. There isn't really one single standard legal definition that everyone agrees on.
Okay.
Generally, the term gets applied to state or local governments. Could be cities, counties that basically have policies limiting how much they cooperate with federal immigration authorities, like ICE.
Limiting cooperation. So what does that actually look like for, say, local police on the street?
Well, it often means things like telling local officers not to ask people about their immigration status during, routine stops or interactions.
Okay.
Or restricting them from sharing someone's immigration status info with ICE.
Right.
And a big one is refusing to hold people in local jail after they're supposed to be released.
Just because ICE asked them to.
Exactly. Based solely on what's called a civil immigration detainer request from ICE without a warrant signed by a judge.
So that detainer request isn't like a criminal warrant?
Not usually, no. It's an administrative request asking the local jail to hold someone for up to 48 hours so ICE can potentially pick them up.
Got it. Now, the Trump administration's recent executive order, it puts forward its own definition, doesn't it?
It does. Their working definition basically says it's any state or local government that has laws or policies restricting information sharing with ICE, or that stops local law enforcement from complying with those detainer requests to hold people for that extra 48 hours.
Okay, so that's the definition they're using. But the real core issue, the fundamental disagreement, it seems to be less about the definition and more about whether local governments should help enforce federal immigration law, or if they even have to.
Exactly. That's the heart of the whole debate, that fundamental tension.
So on one side, you have proponents of sanctuary policies. What's their main argument?
Their core argument is that enforcing federal immigration law just isn't the job of local police or sheriffs.
Their job is local crime, community safety.
Right. And they argue that getting local police involved in immigration enforcement actually harms community safety because it breaks down trust.
How so?
Well, if people in immigrant communities, and that includes the citizens, legal residents, everyone, if they're afraid that any contact with local police might lead to deportation for them or someone they know.
Then they won't call the police when they need help.
Precisely. They're less likely to report crimes, less likely to come forward as witnesses, less likely to seek help. And proponents say that makes the entire community less safe, not just immigrants.
Okay, so that's the trust argument. Now, what about the other side? The opponents of sanctuary policies.
Their main argument is that not cooperating with federal authorities undermines the rule of law. They see it as actively hindering federal law enforcement efforts.
And they raise public safety concerns too, right?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
A major point is the worry that individuals who might be dangerous, maybe have committed serious crimes, could be released back onto the streets from local jails instead of being transferred to ICE for potential deportation.
Is there a specific case they often point to?
The tragic killing of Catherine Steinle in San Francisco is frequently cited. The man charged in her death had been deported multiple times and was released from local custody shortly before the incident, despite an ICE detainer request. Critics use this as a stark example of their fears.
Opponents also argue these policies might act as like a magnet.
Yeah, that sanctuary cities attract more unauthorized immigration, and they raise concerns about the potential strain on local resources, schools, healthcare, housing, things like that.
Fundamentally, their position is that local government should be assisting federal immigration enforcement. It's part of upholding the law.
That's the core stance, yes.
You mentioned earlier there's research on the effects of these policies. What do the sources say about that?
Well, like a lot of things in this debate, the research isn't completely settled. It's complex.
Right. Not a simple yes or no answer.
Definitely not. Some studies referenced in your materials suggest that sanctuary policies don't really have a statistically significant impact on crime rates, one way or the other. Some analyses even found sanctuary areas might have lower crime rates or better economic outcomes compared to similar non-sanctuary places.
Interesting. What about that trust factor? Any data on that?
There was one study mentioned that found Latino residents in places with sanctuary-type policies were actually more likely to report being victims of crime to the police.
Which could suggest that trust element is real.
It potentially points in that direction, yes. But again, other studies might show different impacts or focus on different metrics.
So the takeaway seems to be it's complicated. The data doesn't give a totally clear picture supporting just one side.
Exactly. Context matters. Specific policies matter.
Yeah.
It's not as simple as proponents or opponents sometimes make it sound.
Okay. So amidst all this debate and murky data, the federal government is now pushing harder again with this new executive order. What specifically does it do?
Right. The order from April 28th, 2025, protecting American communities from criminal aliens. It specifically told DHS and the Attorney General to team up.
To do what?
To identify and then publish a list of jurisdictions they consider to be sanctuary jurisdictions. And they had just 30 days to do it.
And it wasn't just about making a list, was it? There were teeth in it.
Oh, yeah. The order directed potential punishments. Things like suspending or even terminating federal grants and contracts to these places, as far as the law allows.
So hitting them in the wallet.
Potentially, yes. And it also told the Attorney General to identify state or local laws or policies that seem to favor aliens over any groups of American citizens and are deemed unlawful, and then take action against them.
Wow. So this really signals around two of the legal fights we saw before.
Absolutely. It picks up right where the previous administration's efforts were challenged in court.
And about that list they published, the Associated Press looked into it.
They did, and they found some issues. The DHS list apparently had around 500 jurisdictions.
Okay.
But the AP reported finding problems like misspelled names, counties listed that have tiny immigrant populations making you wonder why they were targeted, and even some places that actually do cooperate with ICE or have agreements like 287G.
So even places that thought they were cooperating ended up on the list?
It seems so. Some jurisdictions, even ones known to be politically supportive of the administration, were apparently surprised and confused to find themselves named.
That must have caused some chaos locally.
You can imagine. It really highlights the difficulty of trying to apply a single federal definition across the board to all the different local situations.
It's interesting because while the federal government is pushing against limiting cooperation, some states have gone the other way entirely.
That's a really important dynamic here. Several states have passed laws that essentially ban sanctuary policies within their borders.
Mandating cooperation, basically.
Right. Forcing local law enforcement to cooperate with federal immigration requests. Your sources mention states like Alabama, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas as examples.
And we saw a very specific, very recent example of this push in Tennessee.
Yes, that Tennessee law passed just this January 2025. It actually creates criminal penalties for local officials if they vote to adopt sanctuary policies.
Criminal penalties? Like?
It's a Class E felony, which upon conviction could mean being removed from office.
Wow, that sends a strong message from the state level.
A very strong message, yeah.
So you've got this triangle of tension. Federal pressure, state mandates in some places, and then local resistance in others. Let's zoom in on that local resistance with the Colorado example you mentioned, Sheriff Masters in San Miguel County.
Right. Sheriff Masters has been pretty outspoken about this. He says his office focuses on community safety for everyone. Doesn't matter what their immigration status is.
Okay.
He says he does cooperate with federal agencies on things like criminal investigations and warrants. But he emphasizes he does it within the limits set by Colorado state law.
And he sees this new federal executive order as being in direct conflict with that.
He does. He called the EO an attempt to, quote, federalize by intimidation his office. And he feels it's being done for a political cause.
He made a historical comparison, too, didn't he?
Yeah, pretty striking one. He compared the pressure his office feels now to the Fugitive Slave Act back in 1850.
Wow.
He pointed out that sheriffs back then faced similar federal pressure to enforce a law many disagreed with, and some refused, even facing penalties.
That's a powerful parallel to draw. And his worry isn't just about immigration enforcement now.
No, he expressed broader concerns, like if the federal government can force local police to act as immigration agents today.
What stops them tomorrow from mandating enforcement against other groups?
Exactly. He mentioned gun owners, political opponents, protesters, wondering if this opens that door.
Did he mention the 287G program specifically?
He did. That's the ICE program where they make formal agreements with local police to deputize officers for immigration tasks. He noted ICE offers reimbursement and even, quote, awards for locking people up under those agreements.
And it's important to understand the context of Colorado law here.
Definitely. State law in Colorado, which has been upheld by their Court of Appeals in cases involving Teller and El Paso counties, puts real limits on holding people just for ICE.
So they can't just honor any detainer request.
Generally, no. The law primarily allows them to notify ICE when someone subject to a detainer is scheduled to be released. But holding them beyond their release time just for ICE, without a judicial warrant, that's largely prohibited.
There was that specific case mentioned, Ignacio Cruz Mendoza. How did that illustrate the notification part?
Right. He was a truck driver involved in a fatal accident, had prior deportations. When he finished his local sentence in Jefferson County, they notified ICE about his upcoming release, as allowed by state law. ICE was then able to wait and apprehend him immediately after he was formally released from the jail.
So notification happened, cooperation occurred, but within the state's legal boundaries.
Exactly. It shows how that notification system can work without violating the state's prohibition on extended detention based solely on a detainer.
Okay, going back to that DHS list and its inaccuracies, it wasn't just liberal areas finding themselves wrongly listed, right?
No, not at all. That's what was so striking in Colorado.
Yeah.
Counties like Prowers and Kiowa, very conservative areas, strongly supported President Trump.
Had they taken a stance on sanctuary policies?
And yes, they'd actually passed local resolutions explicitly against becoming sanctuary counties. They wanted to make clear they supported cooperation.
And they still ended up on the DHS list.
They did, much to their confusion and frustration.
Wow.
Yeah, local officials there were scrambling, working with their Congresswoman, Lauren Boebert, trying to figure out why they were listed and get removed.
That really shows a disconnect between the federal effort and the reality on the ground in some places.
A major disconnect. It underscores how challenging it is to implement these broad federal mandates accurately.
So with all this federal action, state countermoves, local pushback, it sounds like we're definitely heading back to court, round 2 of the legal battles.
Seems inevitable. And it really boils down to a fundamental clash about federalism.
The balance of power between Washington and the states or cities?
Exactly. The federal government clearly has broad, arguably preeminent power over immigration law itself. That comes from the Constitution, Article 2, Article 4, the Supremacy Clause.
But states and localities aren't just extensions of the federal government. They have their own powers.
Absolutely. They're protected by the 10th Amendment, which reserves powers to the states, and crucially, by what's called the anti-commandeering doctrine.
Anti-commandeering.
Yeah, it's a principle confirmed in big Supreme Court cases like Prince v. United States and more recently Murphy v. NCAA. It basically says the federal government generally can't force state or local officials to carry out federal laws or programs for them. They can't just commandeer state resources.
And we saw this exact legal fight play out during the first Trump administration, right? After the 2017 executive order.
We did. There were lawsuits all over the country. A key one was Judge William Orrick in California.
What did he rule?
He issued a nationwide injunction temporarily blocking the administration's threat to withhold federal funding from sanctuary jurisdictions.
On what grounds?
He cited separation of powers, arguing the president was overstepping his bounds, and also the spending clause of the Constitution.
The spending clause?
Right. The idea that it's Congress, not the president, who controls federal spending and gets to decide what conditions are attached to federal grants.
Did that ruling stand?
The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals mostly upheld Judge Orrick's decision, though they did remove the nationwide scope of the injunction. But then the Second Circuit Court reached a different conclusion in a similar case.
Creating a split between different federal courts.
Exactly, which often sets things up for the Supreme Court.
But it never got there last time.
No, the Biden administration withdrew those cases from the Supreme Court's consideration back in 2021.
But now,
here we are again. This new 2025 executive order has sparked a whole new round of lawsuits.
and some are landing back in familiar territory.
It seems so. Some cases are reportedly back in front of the same judges who handled them the first time around, including Judge Orrick.
Has he acted on the new order yet?
He has already issued a temporary block on the funding threat contained in this latest 2025 executive order.
So the legal arguments being made against the federal action now are pretty much the same ones as before.
Largely, yes. The core claims are still about violations of the separation of powers, the president acting like Congress, violations of the spending clause, Congress controls the money, and violations of the Fifth and 10th Amendments, due process, and especially that anti-commandeering principle.
Okay, so summing this all up, it's really a dynamic, sort of multi-layered conflict playing out.
Definitely. You've got the federal government pushing its immigration authority, using tools like funding threats and lists to pressure locals into cooperating.
Then you have many cities and counties pushing back, talking about community trust, sticking to their state laws, and pointing to the Constitution's limits on federal power.
And layered on top of that, you have states taking their own actions, some banning sanctuary policies outright, creating this really uneven patchwork across the country.
It's a real-world example of how these big constitutional ideas about federalism actually affect communities, isn't it?
It really is. It touches on law enforcement priorities,
Yes.
community relations, deeply held beliefs about immigration, the role of government. It's all in there.
And thinking about Sheriff Master's concerns, it does leave you with something to mull over, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How do we, as a society, strike that balance between the need for federal laws to be enforced and the concerns about federal overreach, about preserving the independence and specific role of local police?
It's a tough question.
Yeah.
And it goes way beyond just immigration policy. It touches on really fundamental aspects of how our government is supposed to work. Something to keep thinking about as these legal and political fights continue.